All right, everybody, thanks for being here. Sorry for the delay. I'm Kate Parsons. I'm the digital art professor over in the fine arts department. Thanks for being here. A few short announcements. Tomorrow, Thursday, October 13th at noon, curator Rotem Rosendahl is going to be at the Wiseman discussing Judaism, creative identity, and contemporary art. If you have any questions about that, I think I saw Andrea Sorority come in. There she is. There's also, mark your calendars for November 3rd at noon, curator Patrick Polk on lived religion, sacred space, and shrine building in LA will be there. Okay, I'd love to welcome our speaker today, who's an amazing artist and a friend. Linnea Gabriella Spransy's paintings, drawings, and installations are generated using systems and rules, which are distillations of her interest in emergent theory, quantum mechanics, theology, and chaos theory. Her work has been exhibited throughout the United States and internationally at numerous academic institutions, including Princeton University and both commercial and nonprofit galleries. Spransy was born in 1976 in Wisconsin. Her father was a synth player in one of the first Christian glam bands to ever tour. Her formative years were spent in a 75-member community in Oregon with a common purse economic structure. Having begun her education in a one-room schoolhouse, she finished it at Yale University, earning her MFA in 2001. At this juncture, her curiosity about science, philosophy, and ultimate questions came to the fore, opening wide, unexpected territory that she has been exploring ever since. So please welcome Linnea Spransy.
Hello. I feel like that description sort of describes one avenue of work that's been very long form for me, but there's probably more I should add to that at this point, which you'll see. Thanks for coming. Nice to see you all. Thanks for spending time with me. Some of you might be constrained to do that, but I appreciate it even so. Okay, so this is my name. Here it is. So the work that I make sometimes gets to be quite large. And in this case, we're seeing a 35, about 20, depending on how I hang it, 20 to 35 feet wide drawing that's on frosted mylar that is a substance. I don't know if any of you know what frosted mylar is, but architects used to use it. It's a plastic substrate that has treatment on both sides so that you can draw on it, and it's gorgeous. It's like very luxuriant to draw on, sort of like ballpoint on banana skin. Have you ever tried that? It's just like beautiful. Try it sometime. Anyway, so it's very fun to draw on, and I laminate it, and then I cut it out and I suspend it. In this case, it's partially clung to the wall. Now, these growths happen, they may look very complex in their end result, but they begin very, very simply. And I have to go into a bit of an explanation for how I can say that. A little warm. So all of these paintings and drawings that you're about to see actually begin with very simple modules. And is the battery going down? Oh, okay. So ooh, here I am. So they start with really simple modules that are basically visual building blocks for me that are self-similar, and they can have a meaningful relationship with each other. Over the years, I think I've only come across maybe 5 or 6 of them. They feel like discovering a letter or a new kind of like substance. And they can build on top of each other. And I decide before I begin every piece how they're going to interact. And I make a series of rules that are often based on very simple numbers that I called kind of the root number of the piece. And in this case, you can see that this hook eye sort of module is building out from a central point in a cluster of 10 without a kind of remainder line. And then in the second square, you can see that it's building out with a remainder line. And in the final one, you're seeing a combination of the two. So that's a mid-range set of behaviors for this particular module. Then they start to build up, and I have a next set of rules which have to do with how they overall grow. So in this case, this kind of simple unit happens 2 times, then 3 times, then 4 times, then 5 times. Very logical, has an internal logic that's really self-similar and pretty simple. But over time, so you can see, you can recognize the intervals in a detail here. And in this detail, but the overall image becomes something like this. So this is an ink drawing that is about only 3 feet wide in this case. And they build up in such a way that they start to have these similarities to the natural world, these near associations that I think are pretty interesting because I'm fascinated in these limitations because they have for me, when something builds up enough, it starts to develop its own sort of intelligence. And I'm interested in reaching that threshold and seeing what's possible, where I myself am surprised, despite the fact that I made every single choice that will govern this image from beginning to end before I even started. But I want to be surprised and led into something new. So it's kind of become this way of making for me in an abstract language that gives me an experience. So it's culminated in all kinds of work and images. This is the most recent piece I made. Each one, the widest one of these panels is probably 6 feet long, and it's nestled in a corner. And my idea was that these panels, which are drawn on both sides and laminated and partially suspended, that they almost create a cocoon that you can walk into and be surrounded by drawing. And they're front to back, and they're slightly tinted with colored pencil. So they're slightly altering in color as you stand in the middle of that, you can see it. And there's a ton of detail to engage you. And you can see that I'm using exactly that same module that I began with showing you. So there's a lot of potential in any one of these modules. So that's my simple sort of explanation of more or less the method. And then there are some overall processes that I have used over the last 20 years to yield different images. So many times I allow these systems to grow in clean space. So any change that occurs is from within the system itself. So it's kind of a pressure from the inside, any change that occurs. So we have examples like this painting, which is 8 feet tall, and is a very sort of like simple rendition of a system that I've used up until last week. So this system has been with me for probably 20 years and it's yielded all kinds of different outcomes. But this is a very simple painting that I made of the kind of shift and change that happens internally without any interruptions. Here's a drawing. I call these research drawings because I never exactly copy any number of these sketches that I make. What they are is I'm playing with different coordinates to see what happens. And I have to press replay if I'm going to make it into a painting, and who knows if it'll turn out the same way. Likely it'll be similar, but probably not exactly. I'm just running through a bunch of these little drawings. These are made on antique paper, so they have a really fun kind of presence. They're very alien looking sort of images. And then here's a painting I made where the module in this case is, it might take me a little too long to explain each one. So I'm not going to reverse engineer every piece for you. You'll just have to trust me that I can explain to you exactly how it was made for those that are interested. And in this case, there's subtle changes in the surface that are really important to me. The final stage, which I don't think you can see very well, is a perfectly clear coat of gloss that is in positive, negative shapes. You'd have to see it in person, but it's the final step of the whole system. And then we have this one, which I laugh because it makes me think that if the Aztec had a metro system, this might be the map to it. It's kind of weird to figure where these languages end up because they have associations sometimes to Art Nouveau or 70s poster art or kind of simple, in some cases, very minimalistic vocabularies, but most of the time they become complex. Here's one where I built in reverse. So everything was masked off and then carved into the masked off area. And then as I kept going, it became more and more masked. And the final move was to pull off all the tape and see what I had made. Very textured piece. And then here's that large piece installed in the gallery. I treat the frosted mylar with a matte agent so that it doesn't have too much gloss and too much like visual bounce and prevent you from really seeing the drawing underneath. Drawing is made with ink, and I'm using calligraphy pens. So it's all very old fashioned. It's sort of funny. I feel like I'm in a scriptorium. I often make them at my desk, and I can only see like small sections at a time, and I roll them up as I'm making them because the final kind of end result isn't what I'm after. I make it in a granular way and then see what I've made at the end. Here's one called Meteorology. Depending on how I hang it, it's either 18 or 20 feet tall. 4 panels. And then again, some smaller studies, multiple layers on frosted mylar. This is 8 drawings on top of each other. And this is a piece where I was very interested in fluid dynamics, which becomes pretty clear when you interact with it pretty closely. Old one. And then this was its sister piece, so they are all related to each other directly. And the way that I installed this piece was as a hallway where you could walk between both of them and look back and forth and look for relationships between the 2 drawings. And then I started using the tactic of disrupting these systems. So many times certainly in life and in systems out in the natural world, it's not often the privilege of those systems to be able to occupy space without interruptions. Many times there are incursions, cataclysmic events, or competing organisms, or all sorts of things that can interfere, even records of previous life forms that have been there before. And so what I do is I choose a system, I know it pretty well, and I will build up a whole iteration of that system and then spill paint all over it and use that as a sort of disastrous event, a chaotic event in the life cycle of the system, of the procedural work. And I will try and rebuild using the same system to see if it can maintain its integrity. And in this case, it looks like I'm doing 3 layers. And the final kind of shrapnel, that kind of lion yellow bits and pieces you see everywhere, is the negative space between every ribbon in the module. So this piece was kind of, it was pretty chaotic. So it may appear at the end that the whole thing is very organic, but the whole time I'm making it, I have to keep exact track of where I am in the life cycle and what I'm doing. So it's all actually quite meticulous in its own way. This one's called Algae Bloom. The blue actually has a lot of activity in it, a whole drawing, but it's almost exactly the same tone as the blue. So it's another thing you can only see in life. A lot of the factors or the elements of my work really only show in person. One thing that I often get is that people are surprised that a human being made this. Sometimes on a screen, it can appear kind of almost removed or mechanical, and then you definitely get a different impression when you're with them in person. So this one, you can again see the spill interacting with the system in these nodules. There's a symmetry to the whole thing. And then this was the next iteration of that same system. So I do them in cycles, 2 or 3 times to see how far the system can change or grow. They sometimes get pretty psychedelic and very textured. This one has a bunch of goopy sections in it. This one, they're mostly pretty large too, because I need to keep track of what I'm doing. So this one, the spills are clear. It's clear tar gel medium used in acrylic. And what's wonderful about this substance is you can really build up thick layers and they won't craze, they won't crack. And you can have these clear windows into what's underneath. So all those paintings I just showed you, there's a tremendous amount of detail and work that has gone before the spill occurred and is now gone from the painting because the spill happened to occur over that area. But in this case, I thought it'd be interesting to do the reverse. Sometimes they end up being pretty serene. This one actually has a symmetry as well, where the positives and negatives are opposite each other vertically. So let's see, you can see. So I kind of enjoy playing with our capacity to recognize pattern making. We are patterned beings and we're always looking for signs of ourselves in the world. And especially symmetry is a really interesting thing that we're always scanning our environment for. And so I'm trying to sort of tug at that without giving you full satisfaction in a lot of ways. But again, this is what happens with the systems that I choose. And I love that they have these kind of flirtations with familiarity. And then another tactic that I've used is where I first create the spill or the chaotic environment, and then I force the system to move through it. And this has yielded a lot of very interesting things. So I have 3 basic kind of tactics where I use these procedural works and the ways that I approach them: the clean space, and then with spills that occur in their life cycle, and then with chaotic environments that are previous to their growth. So I saw the crystal display at the Smithsonian Museum. I don't know if any of you have been there, but they're incredible collections there, and was struck by how the same crystal formation in different environments has profoundly different outcomes. So I started using the same system in different spills and chaotic environments to see what would occur. I did a series of drawings like this, again on antique paper. I got a grant when I was at grad school from the Beinecke Library to plunder their paper archives, and I could walk out with whatever I could carry. And I was pretty strong at that point, so I'm still working through as much as I carried out. I think I was staggering out of the library. So I still use that paper. And then here's another pretty chaotic example of some of the outcomes of using this tactic. And this is a very simple system that keeps being shredded every iteration that occurs. And in this case, the chaotic environment, I kind of created this tactic that's very useful. I'm really interested in flow dynamics. So you can treat acrylic in such a way that it behaves like ink. And so I'd pour that in the center of a canvas and then place plastic over it. So, and then I'd let it be for a couple days and then pull it off. And it's basically a monotype at that point. It's a sort of print, but it's a print of how flow dynamics work, how capillary action works between two non-absorbent surfaces. So you end up with this whole amazing environment that has a lot of structure, and that's useful for me to move a system through. Then this is a very, very large piece. It's 11 feet tall. And this is also one where I'm using that tactic of a monotype, a print that's made with plastic. And then it's a very simple drawing, the simplest expression I could make of the first 5 prime numbers. So starting on, yeah, your left, you can see that the system kind of divides into 2 and then 3 and then 5 and then 7 and then 11, loops back to itself with the 11 units and then continues all the way around. So that becomes like a drawing or a symbol that I use a lot. And here's some details. You can, every time that the system encounters a barrier, all it's trying to do is get around it and get back to itself. So you can see that what happens is towards the right, it starts fraying or disintegrating, almost like an old sweater. And all it's trying to do is like return back to finish its task and to complete the image. So in a detailed area like this, every one of these lines has a really specific trajectory. So I do them one at a time. And yeah, when I'm in the midst of working on one of these, I go to sleep and close my eyes and I still see it in my retina because it's so intense. And it's a lot of problem solving along the way. A lot of interesting moments. Some of these, for instance, this one here, these, I think of them almost as tidal pools. They're little areas that are completely isolated from the rest of the system. And so they can't kind of go complete their function. And I made them yellow so that they're differentiated from everything else because they actually aren't interacting with the whole system. So you encounter lots of strange things like that, despite, again, knowing so much about what I'm doing before I begin. I'm still constantly surprised. And that's a bit of scale, my studio. Okay, so now I'm gonna hit you with something totally different because I have, since basically the pandemic or slightly before it, I started just, I don't know, the wheels came off. I started making all kinds of things and being really interested in all sorts of other things while I'm still making my abstract procedural work because it is an interesting fascination for me. So I became interested in a late medieval text called Ars Murendi. It first appeared in 1450. Ars Murendi translated means the art of mortality. And originally this text appeared entirely in Latin and very shortly was translated into 11 images. And it's basically a manual about how to die well. I became interested in this before the pandemic, and you have to remember that in 1450, we're talking about a long era of the bubonic plague having mown down most of the European population in these successive waves of pandemic. And so this manual about how to die well in the midst of famine, in the midst of the bubonic plague and coming religious wars was really interesting to people. People had a very different relationship with death. And I had been thinking about global warming and how death is something that we are going to be facing much more often in our daily lives, in our environment. And it's also something that we culturally as Americans are not very good at looking directly at. And in particular, with some conversations I've been having with my friends about global warming, a sense of paralysis really kind of can take over. And so I got to thinking, like, surely this is not the only moment in human history where people have felt paralyzed by crisis. And so I started looking for specific moments of that. And this certainly felt like that kind of moment. And Ars Mundi was the response. So this was a little handbook that in the era when the printing press was just being established, 50,000 copies were made of this, which you have to understand is a runaway bestseller. Like that's almost as much as the Bible in that era. So I love that you could argue that a foundational text to our modern era might be a little manual, all illustrations or primarily illustrations about death. So I started incorporating these images in my work, directly quoting them. And part of the reason that I felt it was a match for my work is that my work's very much about the potential of limits. In an abstract language, I'm talking about how limitation can actually be incredibly generative and can, in a way, be beautiful. So using a historic and a somewhat narrative set of images, it felt like a parallel to an abstract set of images that had been building up for me over the last 20 years. And so this was the first piece that I made using directly quoting Ars Mundi images. I'm going to go back to the whole. So when you encounter this piece, it's 4 foot by 4 foot. You don't see the images until you're about maybe 3 to 4 feet away from it, and then they start emerging. And I started treating them like movable type because I think it's interesting that these images, as a person in our era looking back at them, and as someone who's fairly educated about these sorts of images, they still are so strange to me. They're very eerie and odd. And I think it's really amazing that the printing press is partially responsible for the migration in the world, that the shared cultural imaginary space that once made these images like clear to everyone. Again, because most people were illiterate in that era, these images were a better way to communicate that to them than Latin was. And now looking at these images, they're not very clear at all. And part of the reason for that is frankly because of the printing press. And because we live in an era where so many ideas are present simultaneously that we don't have a shared cultural imaginary space that is as kind of hermetically sealed as the late medieval imagination was. So I started treating these images like they were movable type, pulling them apart and placing them within my procedures for making these sorts of pieces. So this piece is called Impatience. And a good half of it is just the abstract work itself. I'm having trouble with this. And then this piece is called Patience. Oops, go this way. So the 11 images, original images, are together in diptychs where they're pairing a virtue and a vice that you face at the end of life. So I'm just directly using those images. This one is humility. Yeah, humility. You can really see the texture in this particular shot. They're really built up. Again, I'm using similar rules as my abstract work, I'm just incorporating Aris Murundi images in the various layers. And this one is Pride. You can see in the upper left, they're faint renderings of some of the demons that were in the original image. They're really sort of charming little creatures, I have to say. They're kind of capering around, but they're having a great time in the Pride section of this particular drawing. And the dying person is always present. You can see his outline, you can see his head. In a lot of these images, the dying person is at the center of the composition. I find that really interesting because in our culture, when people are ill or old, we often put them in corners away from everyday life. And in this case, they're completely surrounded by people. They are the center of activity in a way, not left alone. And that had extra poignancy during the pandemic when so many people died alone. Can't remember which one this is. Yeah, I can't remember. Oh, well. So they're lots of fun to look at. Then in the midst of the pandemic, I don't know, I just felt like I could do whatever I wanted. And I went into grad school on the strength of my pastel work, which I completely abandoned and went through immense change when I was there and became interested in different things. But having done some of this Ars Murendi work, I started to think more and more about the close relationship between life and death, and in particular with global warming, and about how our own bodies are very much a part of this earth, and we are more porous than we realize. And I started thinking about various plants and animals that have strategies for survival that ensure the well-being of their species, often at the cost of the individual. And in particular, I became interested in, and this is not a great photo, but this is in my home, in my library. I just took out my pastels and started working. In particular, I became interested in the Madagascar suicide palm tree, one of the rarest trees on the planet. Their leaves get to be really huge, 18 feet wide, and they live to be 50. And at about that age, they produce a giant efflorescence of blooms, over 1 million blooms. It's about 18 to 20 feet tall, this spike that emerges from the top of the tree. And it's such an energetic event that it then dies. But it perpetuates in this kind of like enormous energetic procreative act. It perpetuates its own species, but the individual dies. And so I got to thinking about that and how there are many examples of mutualism, of cooperation, of self-sacrifice that the natural world has all around us that perhaps could be educational for us. So I started incorporating figures and symbols that kind of emphasize these ideas, and they're kind of like packed with, like, there's a reason everything is in these images the way it is. For instance, the little pine cone on the upper right-hand side, I was looking at a lot of Byzantine iconography at the time, and a lot of times there's a seraphim covered in eyes, witnessing great events of judgment. And in this case, I found this pine cone that looked like it was covered in eyes. It's from Australia. And I thought it was really kind of an amazing stand-in for that sort of judgmental eye in a way, like nature itself in a way, judging us and perhaps finding us wanting. And these figures almost seeming like they're in some sort of baptismal situation, also becoming the flowering of this tree, a chameleon becoming something else. Fungus is really important in our ecosystem. They're the cleaners, they're the janitors of the natural world. We would be in real deep shit, pardon me, if there weren't fungus, like quite literally. So they're very important. This is almost like a tree of life. These kind of twin figures are in an almost amniotic situation. We see sockeye salmon who have, that self-sacrificial impulse of doing the salmon run, going up to their hatching grounds. Anyway, I could talk about every element of this drawing to anyone who's interested. These little globe people things I found in a medieval manuscript of family trees. These are bad iPhone photos. I apologize. Yeah, not so good. But you can see that I'm growing the paper. It's like, as the composition grows, I'm adding paper. The whole thing's very organic. There it is, in situ, at home during the pandemic. Also at home. I now work on these at my studio. Okay. I should let you ask questions. Questions? Nope. What's my time? Am I doing pretty well or? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Hi, sorry, I'm over here.
Oh, hi.
I'm everywhere as a voice, but in a body, I'm right here. I wanted to ask you actually about bodies, because you have ended with this body of work and this image of bodies. And in your early work, you talked a little bit about your own body in the process and like the after image and the intensity and meticulousness of the work. And my sense is that the process is quite different now that the body has entered figuratively into the work. And I'm just curious if you have reflections on that.
Yep. It's really strange to have all these different kinds of work in the same space. And when people ask me about that, I say that it's almost like exercising different muscle groups when I'm working on different types of work. So the procedural work is really soothing because I make choices before I begin and I'm sort of led to a conclusion, whether I like it or not, I'm committed to it. And so there's not this fret of every mark being somehow significant. They're significant on the whole, but it doesn't matter from day to day. I just sort of fulfilled my obligations to the piece. And I'd say that with the figurative work, not so much with Ars Murendi work because it's folded into my procedures with the Ars Murendi work. But with the figurative work, it's much more fraught because, well, there's a whole lot of history when we start pulling the figure directly in as a representation. And you could argue with the abstract work in an inside out way, I might be depicting systems that are interior to our bodies or are interior to the planet, but have familiarity, if not they're not representations per se. So with representations, you're dealing in the world of stories and symbol and art history. And I'm all right with that. I'm all right with plunging into that, but it's fraught territory and I recognize that. So I would say haptically, like physically, how it affects me in making is that the abstract work is actually more taxing physically. This representational work is much more loose, much more fluid, much more, it's on paper. There's something much more flexible and dynamic in a way about it. And that comes with both, that's both a good thing and a difficult thing. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've sort of circled around it a little bit. That's fine. Okay. I think there's a question there. Colors. Yeah. So the question is about colors. That's my one area of freedom, actually, in the abstract work. Almost everything else is determined by these choices I make at the beginning. And so color, I used to have a system to approach that as well. That was random. But now I would say I'm very deliberate about, since I have a sense of where systems will go, I try and choose colors that frustrate our ability to identify specifically what something is, because it isn't anything. But so many of these systems have such strong associations, say, with the natural world, that if I rendered some of them in green, people would be like, oh, algae, or that's a palm tree, and that is not at all what I'm after. So I'm very specific about making sure the colors sort of contradict those associations that are likely. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Lavender. So, as I saw you abstract art, I have I'm trying to understand how you make them.
Uh-huh.
Like, I see different layers, so I'm trying to figure out like how you decide, because they're interfere each other. So, do you draw like one layer first and then do another layer, or do you plan like a sketch ahead of time so you can draw them interfere with each other?
Yeah, there's no sketching ahead of time except for those drawings I showed you that I consider sort of research drawings.
Mm-hmm.
Every layer is complete before I do the next one. So and I decide the number of cycles based on the root number. So for one piece, I might be choosing 3 as the root number, which means that there will be 3 large macro cycles of growth.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the mid level, everything will be based on an integer of 3 as well. And then on the micro level, also based on 3. So there's complete consistency through the whole thing. And I basically don't have to make any choices once I start, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a layer is complete so I'll finish a whole, say for instance, we're dealing with the category of spills where there's an incursion on a finished piece. So I'll finish a system, then I'll spill paint on it. Let's say this is based on integers of 3.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever fragments that remain, I rerun that system and see if it can maintain its integrity. Once that's finished, I do another spill. Run that whole system again, then do another spill and run the system. That's 3 total times.
Okay, but then how in this process you make the painting to like the figure out that you want them to be,
The which?
like the figures, like
figures.
yeah.
It's the same way.
Okay.
I embed the images between the spills. And again, it's a cycle that I've decided beforehand. I make all the choices about how they'll be pulled apart and where they'll be found in between the spills. So I'll do one complete cycle of pulling it apart,
Yeah.
then do the spill, then do the abstract work, then do another cycle of pulled apart Ars Murendi images. So it's very procedural again.
Do you use like different colors in this process, or do
Yes.
you? Oh, okay.
To keep track. because
Oh.
I visually can't keep track of what's happening if I
Mhm.
don't change the colors.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because they're similar to each other, right? The images
Mhm.
are, and the systems are.
Yeah.
So to know where I am, I have to change the colors.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. It's
Yeah.
definitely a very complex system. So I was like trying to keep track
Yeah,
of
they
them.
start,
Mhm.
the reason they look complicated is just because of so many layers.
Mhm.
Like they start so simply. They really do.
Okay.
So, mhm.
Okay.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah, Gretchen. Not always. Yeah. It sometimes if they're too complicated, I need them to be big. Like it's a necessity so I can keep track. I have made smaller pieces, but the scale isn't determined once I make those choices. And in some cases, I get into trouble. That's why I started out making frosted mylar drawings because the scale could be infinite and I didn't need to make that choice. It's trickier when you're dealing with a canvas with, edges. And some cases, they just go right over them. And that's that, you know, that you can't see the whole image. Makes it harder for me because I can't keep track. But yeah, so.
From an outside perception, your figurative work looks much more controlled than your abstract work. Do you feel like your figurative work is more calculated than your abstract work, or
No,
not
the
at all?
opposite.
Interesting.
Which is a funny outcome. Yeah, exactly. The figurative work could be anything at any moment. It could change dramatically. That's even like why they're irregular shapes is because the composition changed and it grew halfway through. Let's maybe go to, and so like that's not something that would ever happen in the abstract work. And the abstract work is so procedural and I've made all the choices before I begin. So I'm just running through the choices, but the end result is so dramatic and chaotic and has a lot of energy. And I find that really interesting because I made the whole thing just kind of inch by inch. So it's an interesting contradiction. These figurative drawings are yeah, they're so dynamic. I could change anything. I'm working on sketches right now and for these kinds of compositions. And one of my methods is I just cut out whole figures and whole sections and paste them over other ones and like completely alter just because it needed it. And that can like from day to day, it's a radically different sketch, because that much change is possible with the figurative work.
Sorry, too many questions. But there's one work that I remember you showed in the earlier ones is the one that you said you carve into them.
Oh yeah, it's way at the beginning. Let's see. Whoops.
Yeah.
Oh, well, now I got rid of it completely. That's not what I wanted. Anyway, let's get rid of this. Okay. That's me? Yeah. That I carved into, I kind of painted it in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's see, that's right here.
Could you explain a little bit more about the process? Like, is it like couple layers? I mean, it's like a couple different kind of like sheet layered on each other, and then you carve each layer, and then by the end, it's like it looks like this.
Okay, so what I did with this piece, it's a bit of an outlier. So it's not, I tried this technique. I covered the whole thing in masking film and basically made the whole painting with an X-Acto knife and a palette X-Acto knife and a palette knife. Made it with knives. And so each layer is kind of like building on top of itself. And so I covered, like I said, with contact with paper or film. And then I kept having to build on top with more and more of that film until the final image. So, I mean, it was me experimenting with a different technique that was inside out, but again, using modules, using the sequences, all that kind of thing, just trying a different way of rendering, I suppose. So it was an unusual way. I haven't done it again. It was pretty intense. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, hope you enjoyed yourself.